Thank you so much for joining us online for tonight's event celebrating Eugene Lim's new novel, Search History. We are so thrilled to have Eugene here with us tonight, along with Gina Apostol. My name is Lily Philpott. I am the programs manager at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. A quick visual description of me. I have short black hair. I'm wearing glasses and silver earrings and a denim jumpsuit. And there is a painting in shades of green and pink on the wall behind me. Please do say hi. Let us know in the chat where you're watching from. I am speaking to you today from Connecticut on ancestral and unceded Pequannock, Pecosset, and Wappinger lands. For those of you who are new to the AAWW, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. We hold frequent readings and conversations like this one, organize community arts programming in New York City high schools and senior centers, run fellowship programs for emerging writers of color, and also publish an award-winning online literary magazine, The Margins. This year, we are celebrating 30 years of the Asian American Writers Workshop with a campaign we launched earlier this morning, AAWW at 30. AAWW at 30 will explore the values and ideas that lie at the heart of the workshop's mission. From the need for an artistic home to interrogating our editorial and archival legacies, this campaign will serve not only as a retrospective of our rich and layered history, but also as a resounding call to envision our future. You can donate to support programs like this one and many more years of the workshop at the link in the Zoom chat, and we hope you will join us online as we continue to celebrate this fall. You can also visit aaww.org, where we just unveiled a brand new homepage, or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. I want to quickly thank our incredible partners at Books Are Magic. You can buy copies of Eugene and Gina's books via the link my colleague T has pasted in the chat. During this event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We will open our event with a reading from Search History. I'll introduce Eugene and Gina briefly, and then we'll turn the mic over to Eugene. Eugene Lim is the author of the novels Fog and Car from Ellipsis Press, The Strangers from Black Square Editions, Dear Cyborgs from FSG Originals, and Search History from Coffee House Press, which we are celebrating this evening. His writings have appeared in The Brooklyn Rail, The Baffler, Dazed, Fence, Little Star, Granta, and elsewhere. He is a high school librarian, runs Ellipsis Press, and lives in Queens, New York. Gina Apostol's fourth novel, Insurrecto, was named by Publishers Weekly one of the 10 best books of 2018. Her third book, Gun Dealer's Daughter, won the 2013 PEN Open Book Award. Her first two novels, Bibliolepsy and The Revolution According to Raimundo Mata, both won the Juan Laya Prize for the Novel, the Philippine National Book Award. She was a fellow at Civitella Ranieri in Umbria, Italy, and at the Emily Harvey Foundation, among others. Her essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Foreign Policy, Gettysburg Review, Massachusetts Review, and others. Please join me in welcoming Eugene and Gina, and in welcoming Eugene to our virtual stage to read from his novel.
Radio City, you did a great job. Oh, thank you very
much. Hello. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm going to read two brief passages. The first is a little longer. The only thing you need to know, this is from Search History, is there's a character in this first bit whose name is sometimes spelled Gene, G-E-N-E, and sometimes spelled Gene, J-E-A-N, but you should be able to figure it out from context. So here's a bit from the beginning of Search History. The dysthymic artificial intelligence scientist who wished she'd become a poet extracts herself from the story written by Cesar Ira by putting down her glass of now diluted diet beer and rising from the couch. All goes dark, except for a spotlight shining on a hastily constructed pinewood stage. One hears footsteps clacking. She finds her mark, blinking a few times in the harsh light. She says, "Grief has changed me, various deaths, the death of my best friend, the death of my parents, quote, littler deaths, pinging like raindrops around me, other more booming, larger and closer deaths, and each a spiritual tremor, some annihilating earthquakes. And only now, after digesting them partially or whole, it seems I might finally begin to acknowledge all the loss that seemed inevitably to come with life. Prior to the deaths of my parents, before I was forever orphaned, in that era of their slow and then sudden decline, the saying that made most sense to me, that most articulated the changeover, was something I had heard years prior. A stranger had said it to me at a bar. Someone had quoted to me an old Yiddish saying, "When the father gives to the child, both laugh. And when the child gives to the father, both cry." At the time, I remember thinking, what about the mother? When does she laugh and cry? But subtracting the chauvinism, it's still an accurate description of a certain tide turning. How much delight my daughter used to get from a toy, something cheap and foolish to purchase for her, like a plastic bauble in a bubble from the coin-operated machine in front of the supermarket. "Please, mommy, please, can I have one?" Why should I succumb to her importunings for such a stupid and in fact detrimental gift? One that inculcates within her not only a toxic materialism, but like a gambler's fallacy, incentivizes a future habit of similar whiny requests. Why? Because she calls me her angel when I give her the coins to operate the machine. Because she giggles at the clear plastic bubble holding inside it, oh, real joy, a plastic pullback motorcycle in the shape of a bumblebee. "Look at," she tells strangers, "look at what mommy got me." So the corruption is tied intrinsically with those first joys, right from the beginning, purity impossible, which isn't the problem, purity. No, that's no longer it, though for some time I admit it drove me. That was the wannabe poet within me, some teenager caught in arrested development, crusading hardcore, a vision unmuddied by experience, whom, by the way, I don't disparage. That's the spirit that will save us, if anything will save us. But now it's no longer the vexing question, the day-to-day problem. Now it's just a question of the loss, the losing and the loss. Now it's trying not to die so much every day, to not have the dying happen around me so much, to not see the dying even in that which is coming to life, to not be crushed every moment by the loss, the loss, the loss. In the city, you run into someone at the movies or at a poetry reading, or less often in line at the DMV, and you think, hey, there's my friend. But the sweet, tenuous link between people that we name so easily as friendship can barely be held in the mind. I like to go to lunch, one-on-one with a friend. That's what this is all about, what we're leading up to, that kind of lunch. That kind of lunch is the best. A casual meal, and maybe you'll do something after together, maybe you'll spend the whole day and night together, or maybe it'll just be an hour or so, and then you're both off. In the middle of life, I found myself at various times in darkish diners and overheated and undercooled dives, and compared notes on relative states of entropy and disillusion with a dozen or so Virgils who ate overdressed Cobb salads, icy Mulnigans, fluffy sandwiches de miga, meaty momos, or hockey puck cheeseburger deluxes. And we looked across battered and crumbled tables at each other, trying to name the things we could name, particularly the pretty nimbused phantoms we were in the middle of losing, but also the movie stars and something we saw last week, as well as the gossip about the wrong turns of others. Hidden in the jibes and tales and joshing, of course, were those things we couldn't quite name, but which we might make a gesture or joke toward, and also we'd laugh at or call out each other's sentimentality and romanticism, and maybe most importantly, we would leave unsaid the things we couldn't bear or care or, for whatever reason, were unable to even think about. Like, for instance, several years ago, I met for lunch my friend Jean, who used to go by Jean. Jean had transitioned after I first met her, so sometimes I still misgendered her as Jean, which wasn't so offensive to her, so she claimed, but still it was embarrassing for me when I'd catch myself doing it, old habits being tough to break. "How's it hanging, Jean?" I'd say, and she would smile brightly, as would I, because in fact, occasions for us to get together were far too rare, though neither of us knew why. We were meeting for lunch near my apartment in Jackson Heights. It was a warm enough spring afternoon that we'd grabbed some empanadas from a Uruguayan bakery, made a second trip for some Vietnamese iced coffees, and taken our paper bags and plastic cups to sit on a park bench in the sun on a little grass and dirt half block that passed for a park in our city. In other words, a perfect lunch. And that was that section. Thanks to you all for tuning in. Thanks to the staff of the workshop for all the excellent support and organizing. I'm going to read just a short bit more, but since this is a launch and I wanted to make a few very brief thank yous, fewer than I should, but here they are. Thank you forever and with great love to Joanna, Sondheim, and Felix. I also need to thank by request Felix's Stuffy, which is shaped like and named avocado. I'd like to thank the hardworking people at Coffee House Press, Chris Fishbach, who acquired the book, my editor, Erica Stevens, Daily Far, and Courtney Rust in publicity, Kelly Hultgren in production, Sarah McKee, who did a wonderful job copy editing the book, and everyone else at Coffee House. Mariah Spence, my agent, who really is a blessing. Thank you, Mariah. Thank you to my family, to my father, Kungu Lim, my mother, Kunki Lim, and my sister, Karen. This book and reading are dedicated to my friend, Ning Lee, who returned to the original source on November 1st, 2017. Honor and love to his surviving family, Mrs. Pei Xian Wang, Mr. Dao Li, Laura Garrity Lee, and Rosanna Lee. Ning, my friend, is in this book, and I write about him both directly and indirectly, and I thought I would end with just a brief page where he appears. So this is from the book. When you were dying of incurable disease, I cursed your life choices, not those that led to your dying, but those that led you farther away. For instance, the choice to abide in time. I think I knew you best, and so now am amazed how mysterious you were to me. What were you thinking? All those years and hours, what were you thinking? We were friends most of our lives, but if I live long enough, that will cease to be true. It's impossible to conceive all those years without your weight in them, like papers without a stone to hold them down. They flutter across the field, scattered, gone, now trash. I remember after your first girlfriend killed herself, a scarring tragedy. You read in a novel about a man who spent all his time melting down gold, molding it into little animals, then melting them down again, an incessant cycle of formation and dissolution. You said you felt the same way, that such a repetitive, pointless task was all you were then capable of. After your death, I recall all the work done trying to accumulate and gather papers, pile them neatly, tamp them square, leave them on the table beneath the paperweight. But I can't remember why. And when the wind scatters them across the field, I'm not moved to begin collecting them again. And in fact, as that breeze takes them away, scattering and scattering and scattering, I'm almost pleased, or at least a similar feeling passes through me. Hardly a day goes by, etc., etc. Why you, blah, blah, blah. Where did you go? And so on and so forth. I loved you, yada, yada, yada.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eugene, for that reading. I'm very moved by it. I'm very moved by your choices. I was going to start out with asking you about how you do your art, but I'm going to follow first what Lily had asked. My name is Gina Apostol, and I'm going to do some visual pointers here. I am Filipino, so I'm brown skinned. I am wearing my work clothes, which includes, I thought, in honor of dogs, or maybe it's a cow, I don't know, it's an animal kind of thing going on in my animal spots on my coat. And I am on a sofa, a yellow sofa, before a wall of books that is my living room. My living room is a wall of books. So welcome to all of you to Eugene's reading. And I'm going to just, I just wanted to speak to the choices you made. Even in the reading, how very moving it was for me to hear them out loud. Now, your own novel itself moves through many different forms and formats and times and spaces. So the pieces you chose had that singular voice of mourning and loss. But I want to say something about what I said very early on about the book, the pleasure of art making, a kind of pure art that is in it. I think what I mean by that is the for me anyway, this is what I experience with your books. It's a kind of sheer joy that comes to me in reading your books. I can't quite describe what it is. My partner, for instance, during the pandemic, he was he would read during some very bad times politically. He'd start reading about, let's say, the January 6th insurrection, and he'd get mad and he'd say, okay, 12 with that. I'm just going to do something for the pure fun of it. I will read search history, because he was reading your book. I gave him a copy of your novel. And he said that every time he took the book, it was just pure pleasure. And that has been my feeling too with the books that I've read by you. As you know, I teach Dear Cyborg. So my first question is, what makes you write? There must be something in your impulses that leads to this pleasure that a reader has in your books. And you could put it together with the genesis of search history. So I don't know if they go together, but what makes you write?
Well, thank you, Gina. It's an honor to do this with you. It's a pleasure to do this with you. And I forgot the task of visually describing myself. So I'm Korean American. I have a mustache that my son does not really like when I give him a kiss, and I'm wearing a hat, and I'm in my apartment, which there's a rug behind me, and there's a couch and lamp behind me. And I'm wearing a blue shirt, which is also the shirt I wore to work today. The text, one thing that I would say that I try to do is I try to have momentum going so that there's a kind of propulsion forward, especially with some of the genre pieces or the genre kind of influence pieces. And I think those can be fun for that reason. But I do try to subvert that escapist principle and try to freight it with ideas, and ideas I also think are fun and propulsive. But in my very first book, the beginning was not as inviting, maybe. And after that, I thought, I should make the entrance into the book easier. And this was actually, the talking heads come up a few times. I am not actually, well, I shouldn't say that I'm not a huge talking heads fan, but it wasn't really, they weren't a pop band that was, part of my teenage years exactly. But David Byrne, I remember this quote from him where he said, I forget, he was talking to some artist, and he said, you have to give the audience or the reader a handrail sometimes. And so definitely that's part of the momentum aspect of it. In terms of the genesis of this book, though, I think the origin story of this book was a little different than the others. Dear Cyborgs, there was a question of protest and politics that kind of drenched that book. In this book, you and I, Gina and I, have talked about kind of the secret engines or the secret seeds or hearts of novels. And I kind of, after we talked, I thought, after we had a previous conversation, I thought maybe all writers or maybe even all artists have this secret engine of hidden grief or hidden loss, or maybe it's not always grief or loss, but some issue which is ineffable or inarticulable or raw, or they want to keep private. But yet this engine drives their work, or drives the story, or drives in the sense that we try to take this thing that is very personal or ineffable or inarticulable or hidden or tacit or somehow occluded, and then we transform it into art somehow. And we have to, because the original thing that we're looking at, it's almost too bright. We can't, it's like the sun. We can't look at it directly, so we have to do it indirectly. So in this book, the passages that I chose to read. And I think it is a funny book, and those passages were a little on the serious side. But in this book, I do have two little autobiographical bits, and those are kind of feints, or those are kind of maybe even letters or to the reader to show them what this secret engine is almost. And one is titled Autobiographical Interlude, Dead Friend, and the other one is about my mother. And those are very personal, kind of almost nonfiction pieces transformed into poetry. I think poetry is nonfiction, actually, and fiction is fiction. Poetry is nonfiction. But those are pieces where I kind of show you the secret engine of the book, and why all these other adventure tales and goings on kind of spring from that. But so in one way, it opens the door a little bit so you can peek in. But even there, it's made into art. So those two answers about where the pleasure or the propulsion of the text might come from, and then where the germ or where the heart, the secret heart of this book might be.
Yeah, you definitely brought up in the reading that you did that trope of loss, and I think that does occur in Dear Cyborgs in many ways, and definitely in the quest novel that you have here, in Search History. The quest novel is always a novel anyway about something that's absent, some loss. And
I
so
think the detective novel or the quest novel, but specifically the detective novel, it's a real, that story, I think there's a reason novelists kind of sometimes default to that or find themselves in that story, because the quest, or like the hidden search for the missing person, or the MacGuffin, or that object, that motivates so many plots. Mm-hmm. And the quest, the thing that you're questing for, the thing that you're searching for, it's almost unimportant. It's that seeking or that search, which mm-hmm. is so novelistic or so tempting for the novelist.
Yeah, the craft piece there in the genre form, like the detective or the quest novel, is definitely clear, because you have, for a writer, it's very seductive, because you already have, there's a space issue, so you're already going to be describing space. There's definitely an object that you're looking for, that you're searching in Search History there. And so the elements of plot are already beautifully there in the genre form. At the same time, that for me, what's also very intriguing in your very clear use of the genre plot, the thematic resonance of the form that you chose with the story and idea that you have. And your ideas are multiple. They're all very layered. So you're always layering multiple political and social conundrums and contradictions and questions within that genre plot that you choose to do. So I wonder if you do have actually a theory about loss in the novel. What is that? How does it propel fiction? Because it's, the connection between craft and theme is so interesting. So
I don't know if I have a theory about it.
Yeah.
But I do. Well, in as much as I have. Well, this is my only theory. This is as far as I got, and is that. Well, we spoke about this idea of this central grief, at least for this book, and you kind of have to keep it hidden. You kind of can't face it directly. More or less what I said before, but you do have to But I think that when you come to the page or when you come to the screen to work, it's there. It's the central question of your life. Perhaps, or it's at least something that is so central that when you come to write, that secret engine, which may be grief, may be loss, or may be you know, even in the politics of cyborgs and the protests of cyborgs, I think that was about grief and loss too, but maybe in a social setting and also in a personal setting. But maybe I should only speak for myself. But that grief gets transmuted into art in some way. So that's as far as I got in terms of the theory about it. But somehow that's, I think, where the source springs from. That's as far as I got with in terms of theory. And then in terms of the mystery and the missing persons case, I think you're right. It is a seductive trope and genre, and it's seductive because that's kind of, well, that's a lot. That is a narrative that we put upon our lives, that we're goal-oriented people, and that we're seeking things out, and so that's why it's so seductive. But I think what actually happens is we just kind of drift along, and we lie to ourselves, or we tell ourselves we're going after something when the universe is just happening to us.
And I know we've had these conversations where our ways of thinking about how we deal with where the universe is taking us are really multiple. I want to say about your what you just said about the mystery. You know, if you think about the Western tradition, definitely the mystery, you know, that's Oedipus Rex. You know, that's a detective story. Oedipus Rex, Sophocles's play, is a detective story. And then if you think about the origins of the short story, as we know it, it more or less begins with Poe's detective fiction. And your work definitely works with all of these different angles. You have you have the Buddhist question there on page 27. I'll get to that later. And I don't know, do you want to go with the Buddhist question, or do you want to go with the dog question?
Go with the dog. I'll have the dog one lead into.
Because I do have the dog question. You have several chapters called Shaggy Dog when I love that very knowing kind of naming of the tropes and structures that you do in your novels. I think for me, that's part of the huge pleasure that I have, the kind of metafictive work that you do. Can you tell us a story about the dog, why you had the dog? Of course, okay, here's in an American novel. Now, this is just me as someone who grew up in the Philippines, you know, a dog has all the emblems. While for me, for instance, a dog is a dog. It's just a thing. I mean, I'm not a dog lover. I'm kind of a dog hater, which is really one of the most blasphemous things I think you can say in America. You can call Americans colonizers, imperialists, dirty capitalists. They'll be okay. But if you say I hate dogs, that's the end of your humanity. Okay. So I'm a monster, but I love the very clear American rhetoric, the playing with Americana that happens with the robot dog in search history. But I know you're doing something else with it. First of all, could you tell us about how you got into the dog, the story of the dog?
It has to do with Eileen Miles, and Eileen Miles wrote a memoir after their dog passed. I believe the dog's name was Rose or Rosie, but Eileen Miles, I love. They're bold and they're generous and they're defiant, and they kind of are a key player in the East Village poetry scene in American poetry in general. And I'm a big fan. And I think I tried to get Eileen to do an event for cyborgs or blurb cyborgs, but for whatever reason, it didn't work out right at that moment. But then later, I believe that Eileen read the book and liked the book, and was going to come out with their memoir called Afterglow, which is a memoir about, and they throw their voice. Eileen throws a voice, and it's from the point of view of the dog, in large parts. And Eileen's going to have this event for the launch, just like tonight, but in person, and invited a few other writers. All the other writers that Eileen invited had written books from the point of view of dogs or had some big dog element in it. And to my knowledge, I had never written about an animal at all up to that point, I think. But when you were talking, I realized that there are two animals in cyborgs. There's the stuffed eagle in the Rauschenberg Combine, and then there is a dog that in the footnote where oh, I'm blanking on the name, but there's this protest where against the Vietnam War, which I'm blanking on his name, where someone distributed flyers saying that we're going to burn a dog in protests, and everyone showed up. It was the largest protest in Pennsylvania history or UPenn history, wherever it took place. And then the same Asian American activist who I'm going to blank on their name, but they passed around a flyer that said, "Okay, now you've saved this dog's life. What can you do for the children and the people in Vietnam?" So it was a great moving story, actually, and use of dog. But anyways, I didn't have any dog stuff, but I had in Cyborgs, as you know, or maybe you don't know in the audience, but it's a book about monologues. A character comes onto stage, so to speak, speaks a monologue, and then fades out, and another character comes on stage. So I thought that I just had a little idea where, okay, a character will monologue to the dog. And that was the genesis of that story. And then that was an early chapter. And then the rest of the Shaggy Dog scenario actually flowed out of it. But you were right that dogs are so interwoven into society, especially American society. That's big. And I will say that since you brought up Buddhism, there is a way that the dog's story kind of led to this Buddhist idea and AI in some ways.
Yeah.
I'll try not to get lost in the weeds, but I'll tell you about the dog. There's an epigraph in the book, which is in Zen, there are koans in Japanese, kongan in Korean, and these are generally famous cases or famous stories, and then a teacher will use them to lead a student really into some understanding about the nature of reality, at least as Zen sees it. And usually these stories are something like, the general structure is, one person said A, or the nature of reality is A, and the nature of reality is also not A. So which is it, A or not A? That's what they present. That's one way of shattering dichotomy that a teacher might try to bring a student towards. And there's this famous one where the Buddha says all beings have Buddha nature. This Joju, or this other Zen teacher says, when asked if a dog has Buddha nature, said no. So the question to the student is, does a dog have Buddha nature? And this is an investigation. I didn't mean to get all into the weeds about this, but this is an investigation into ideas of self and ideas of identity. So it naturally led to these questions also, which I thought was a nice synergy. And also the other thing, which I'll mention only because you are a big Freud scholar and a big Freud reader, is that I discovered somewhere during the writing that Freud had a couple chow chows, and his daughter would complain that Freud loved the dogs more than her, almost in a classical transference kind of move. And so I named one of the dogs, I think the only dog that's named after Freud's dogs. And I don't know if it's pronounced Yofi or Jofi, but Freud's dogs are in the book.
I love Freud's dog in the novel. Yeah, I really do think that there was a connection somehow. And I think it's for the but I do think it's for the reader to do those connections among the AI identity, loss, death, mourning, and dog pieces in the novel. But it's that kind of mixing and really fluid moves into something unexpected, the drone, all of these things that occur in the novel, that I think it is for the reader to do. Like, you're correct, I think, as a writer, to say, okay, these are what are there, but I'm not gonna spoil the reader's fun by putting it all together. But I will get to that passage on page 27, where you directly talk about, it's called Dog Assist. And it's a passage that kind of comes between the dog, well, what do you call them? Dog whisperer? I don't know what they're called. Dog watcher? What's that American occupation where you're taking care of a dog? I don't know.
Dog sitter or dog
Dog
whisperer?
sitter. Okay, dog sitter.
sitter, yeah.
I don't, Filipinos don't have words for those. It's on page 27, Hello Dog. And it goes on about the weather. I've been thinking of a question. So she's talking to the dog through this microphone. Anyway, that's for the reader to figure out how to see the scene. You have to get the book, Search History, to know how the scene plays out. You and I are Buddhists, right? You have set that as my default worldview, yes? These days we seem so concerned with identity and race, but the key teaching of the Buddha is that there is no self. Quote, to study the self is to forget the self. Right, so why are we so hung up on identity? Okay, so that's part of page 27. And my question for you with that, I think that in one sense, that is where the book gets very overtly political, and in a sense also, in my view, extremely artful, in that it gets to the core of a question by simply asking the question, by telling, not showing, which I think is a very artful thing to do. It goes against the grain of the show, don't tell mantra, this kind of antediluvian workshop advice that writers get that I think is very harmful. So how do you view the importance of identity in Asian American art? Here we are launching your novel in the Asian American Writers Workshop. And I'm sure that that's a question here for the readers, given the intellectual, philosophical genre quest novel that we have. How do your mind's gears work given that question? And why do you tell us this stuff instead of so-called show us? I mean, what is that a political gesture?
Okay, I'll answer some of those things. I think show versus tell, I think you're right. It's a weird rule. I think it helps, show versus tell helps a person write a very particular kind of story. But if you're making art, I think it's what you get away with or what you do. And if you show well or versus if you tell well, you can get away with it. So I think that those are just one of those rules that are kind of have this hidden ideology embedded in them. But identity, it's a big topic, and I think that there's like at least two viewpoints that passage is getting at. One is kind of an overhead general view, which is just kind of philosophical, and it's kind of a Buddhist idea, or maybe just a general idea in modernity, that we're going to see how identity is dependent, interdependent, emerging. It's not isolated and self-made. Our identity is not something that is simply a separate being, but it's contingent always on the environment, the society, and our history. So that's kind of a general overview and kind of looking at how interdependent our sense of selves really is. I mean, there's I think it is a Buddhist book, and there are things that are very Buddhist that I have thought about. And one of the things that is kind of core for me is this Japanese writer and Buddhist philosopher named Dogen, and he has this kind of, it's a 4-part phrase, but I'll just give you the 2 parts or the 3 parts. To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. So I think if we really ask that question, who we are, we find that our sense of self dissolves. So that's the general, like, big picture view. But what kind of, when we are talking about identity, especially in this space, we're talking about race and class and more tribal questions of identity. And even if we admit that these are socially constructed, we have to live within them and live with them. And I think what the book and what maybe is a struggle for me, or maybe is a struggle for a lot of these questions in these hyphenated spaces or in a place like the Asian American Writers Workshop, is questions of authenticity. am I an authentic X? Am I an authentic Asian American? Or, you know, and in this book, it makes fun of this idea in various ways. There's the inauthentic sushi restaurant, and there's questions about what that means. And it's authenticity is a weird thing. It's like this outward judgment upon oneself. It's not from inside. It's like, and it's often filled with shame or like a feeling of falling short. But we've talked about it in a slightly, and I'll end with this. We've talked about it. You and I have talked about it in a slightly skewed sense of identity of Asian America, because in some ways you're transnational in the sense that you came fully formed, so to speak, as an adult immigrant. But your sense of yourself is firmly rooted in your coming of age in the Philippines. Right? Whereas there are Asian American, like I'm a second generation, I'm a child of immigrants, and we have been cast or held between two worlds. And so we're, in some ways, our psyche is more bifurcated, or I don't know if it's correct to say, a little bit more split. But the thing is that even in your case, as we've spoken of Insurrecto, and in mine, the home country or the immigrant identity and the American identity, or the hegemonic identity that's related to hegemony, those are interrelated. Those are so integrated that it's impossible to separate them out. So in your book, the colonizer and the colonized are constantly reflected. And I think that amongst Asian Americans, there is an integration of our parents or our ancestors' culture, our parents' culture, our home culture versus the American culture, and those are always in tension, but we can't get rid of either. So.
Yeah, and I will say this, looking at, you mentioned that difference in the way one centers oneself, the centering, the bifurcation of the person who grows up Asian in America is very different from the, like, almost, I would say, going with what your novel has been doing, the fake sense of unity that a Filipino growing up in the Philippines has about the South, that the Filipino is this complete unified South that I grew up with. And in both cases, the sense of fantasy and the sense of that other part of identity, which is the recognition that there's something fake about it. There's something fake about the concept of a unified whole person. That you're saying is that kind of Buddhist way. And I think that just in terms, I think maybe one of the pleasures for me of your novels, Search History definitely, is that it brings to, it gives ground. It breaks open that really crucial aspect of the question of identity for us in America and elsewhere, that it is a thing that is not real in a way. There's something irreal about it, so that irreal fiction actually works very well for that political theme of identity.
If you take the Dogen and just change a little bit, to study identity is to forget identity. Or to at least
but
you
understand. It doesn't mean you don't study it.
You kind of have to go
Doesn't mean
through
it's
study.
not there and it's not real. It's not something that has, violent repercussions. But there's also the fact of your recognition when you're in there, and this is what's happening in your novels all the time, that kind of seamless worlding that you do, multiple worlds open up to that multiplicity that is in fact identity. So, and that multiplicity means that there's a kind of forgetting of that unified self. I don't know if there was, is Lily, or were you telling us to shut up?
No, not at all. This was fascinating. I love what you just said actually about seamless worlding. I feel like that's such a beautiful and really apt description of Eugene's work. I did want to get to some audience questions because we have some incredible questions here. I'm going to start with an easy one for you, Eugene, from Joseph, which is, what is your cat's name?
What? Did
We
the cat
can
show up?
see
Oh,
in
look,
chat.
the cat showed up. Louis. Actually, his first name is Louis, and his second name is also Louis.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So from Shannon, Shannon said, Victor Hugo did experiments in spiritualism, seance, where he spoke to greats like Shakespeare, Plato, and Hannibal. If you could speak to a dead comedian, which one would you speak to and why? And Gina, I'd love to hear your answer to this as well.
Dead comedian. There are some great dead comedians. Probably Kaufman, Andy Kaufman.
You have someone you'd like to speak to, Gina?
That might be.
Oh,
You-
that comedian. There are Filipino comedians that I've loved. One of them is Dolphy. I love Dolphy. He died. And he had a very interesting, I don't know, he was interesting. And I've never spoken directly to a famous Filipino comedian. So yeah, I would talk to Dolphy.
Amazing.
I think I should probably have said Pat Morita, because Pat Morita shows up, and he started out as a stand-up, and his life is actually, his entire biography is encoded in the clown chapter. But he had a very difficult life, where he kind of grew up. Anyways, I won't go into it, but Pat Morita's life, he had suffered from this this disease that kept him in bed for like 10 years of his life. And then right when he got healed, the internment camps were happening, and he could walk, finally, and then he's sent to prison. And then his life continues to be hard for a while. Anyways, and but he wanted so much to perform and be in show business or be a comedian. And so he was an interesting figure, and so he's embedded in the book. So that's probably who I would choose.
Thank you. Tammy said, congrats, Eugene. One thing I really love about your work is how elegantly maximalist it is. How do you go about ordering these varied things and people and scenes?
Order is an interesting question. But maximalist it has a lot going on, but it kind of chooses gestures from the maximalist kind of genres, but it doesn't. But I don't think it's actually. It doesn't blow out all those different scenes and details and in all their potential glory. But it just chooses a few things, so you go, "Oh, I'm in that world." So it's a kind of a trick of efficiency in some ways to bring you into those maximalist worlds with minimum detail. How you order them, I don't really know. But I think that one thing about these worlds or these scenes within these worlds, they don't, if you read the book, you'll see all those different worlds, they can live next to each other. They're slightly torqued and not exactly the same world each time. But something I enjoy doing, almost something that I have figured out that I have to do, is like when you come to write, if you're plotting through a plot that you've defined, or you know that you have to get characters from A to B, it's work to get them from A to B. Often you have to work it out. But if you, on another sense, if you know A and B, where you're going to be, and you set up those beginning and end lines, and you know it's kind of tropey or genre-y, in between, instead of having to muscle all the mechanics from A to B, you get to improvise. You go, I know I'm going to get to B. B is so obvious. It's going to be a car scene. It's going to be a car chase, and it's going to end with a crash or something. But you know that the crash is coming, and then you can just play. And then if you come to your writing station or your writing time, and you don't know what you're going to do that day, that makes it more fun and more interesting. And so then the ordering kind of comes from improvisation, and improvisation has its own rules. as rules that you learn as you do them.
Amazing. Thank you. It feels like we are all sitting through a craft lecture right now. I'm so grateful for this. And I have one more question from Annalise, who says, "Hi, Eugene. In class last week, we debated what it means to be as interesting to the AI as our pets are to us. Can you tell us what this means for you?"
This was a phrase that the Mackenzie work, a friend and neighbor, or Mackenzie used to live a few doors down, and I don't know her very well, but I have admired her writing, and we got a drink once, and they told me this incredible line, and to me, what that line really means is it sets up kind of an allegory of comparisons, or an allegory of hierarchies, where we have to be as interesting to this kind of concept of these AI robot overlords as our pets are to us. And what I think is interesting about it is that right now we are in this subservient role to kind of a plutocracy that is, and there's a section in the book that line is embedded in, is we are already kind of in this subservient role, except it's not robot overlords, it's this weird capitalist class. And we just have to be as interesting to them. We have to be servants to the rich. And in the same way, our pets kind of have to be interesting to us for us to cater to their whims. Other people have, mutually respectful relationships with their pets, I'm sure. But there is a power dynamic, and I think that's what that line means to me.
Amazing. One last question just came in from Solveig. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. And it says, "You mentioned in interviews that you roughly finished the book in February 2020 pre-pandemic. What has changed for you viewing your own book through the lens of this pandemic and through the vortex of grief, both personal and on a mass scale during this time?"
Thanks, Solveig. I think I know that, Solveig. I don't know. I didn't know I finished in February 2020. We obviously went through this massive change, and I did not know into what world the book would come out in. If that makes sense. I think the pandemic, this situation that we're in, is very difficult to write about while we're in it. I took a shot at it a couple times in short stories, but I've really had a difficult time writing about it because it's so we're in it. So I don't know. It was a different world, but I do think that the fundamental thesis is the wrong word, but the idea that when we're faced with grief, it leads us to look at something and try to articulate a response to that which really we can't understand and we can't articulate a response to. So we make up different stories. Being aware of those stories, being aware of what they cost us and what's at play within them, I think is important. And as we come through this trial of whatever this has been, if we are able to learn something from it, that would be useful. And if we are able to see what stories we have been telling ourselves that maybe don't fit anymore, and maybe we can come up with better stories.
That's a beautiful note to end on. But before I close, I did want to say, Gina, if you had any last questions for Eugene, I wanted to give the last question to you if you did.
Yeah, I'm going to throw him that question that he likes to ask me. Do you have hope, Eugene?
So Gina and I were talking over
with our experimental Negronis.
Experimental Negronis, and that gave a nice gloss to the evening, I will say. Hope. There is, I think, the key if you really want to get it. Okay, so when I asked Gina this question, she said, no, I don't have any hope. And then she said the next 15 minutes were about things that she was hopeful about. I think I will also have a contradictory answer. I will answer this way. I think fundamentally, the trick is not to have hope or hopelessness, but to try to see clearly what happens. So again, the book is a book about stories and about how we tell ourselves narratives. So you can have a hopeful narrative or a hopeless narrative. But if you drop all of that, then you can just see what is clearly in front of us. So that might be the best way to approach it. On the other hand, so in other words, if you have hope, if you're hopeless, you're in despair. And if you're in hope, it's kind of that phrase from the Cyborg's quote, half quote of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That's a cognitive dissonance. Why? Because your brain is saying, no, it's not going to go work out. We're fucked. This place is really not, there's all kinds of problems politically, economically, and environmentally. But on the other hand, you have to try. So what are you going to do? So you have this cognitive conflict. But one way to resolve that conflict is to put all that down and to say, like, I'm a fan of Ram Dass, actually. I think this is from a talk of his where he said, if you're present, if you're clear, and everything is going great, then you can kind of be in the moment, accept it, and be joyful in a sincere and a real way. And if everything is going to pieces, then you can be clear and present so you can help, or so that you can react in a productive way and hopefully in a compassionate way. So hope might be the wrong question. It's not really the wrong question. But one way to resolve that question of hope and hopelessness is to try to remove ourselves from that dichotomy. But if you want to be really truthful, I am a little hopeful. I am a little hopeful.
Oh, yay. I would say that the work that you do, the kind of resolving of that through story, which is what you do through art, it's very sustaining. It's sustaining for your reader, and I think it is sustaining for the artist.
Thank you. It's something that I enjoy coming to it. So there must be hope there.
Yeah.
Agreed. We have reached the end of our hour, so it is my great pleasure to just sort of close us out with just thanks to everyone. I want to thank Eugene so much for joining us, for writing this beautiful book, and the others. Please do buy a copy of Search History, of Dear Cyborgs, Gina's books as well. If you scroll up in the Zoom chat, there's a link to our friends at Books Are Magic where you can find and purchase all of their books from one of our favorite indie bookstores. Thank you, Gina, so much for guiding this conversation so brilliantly. For that last question too, we like to end on hope. And I want to make sure to thank our incredible ASL interpreters, Amelia, who's on screen now, and Idra, who was on screen earlier. Thank you both. And thank you to Pro Bono ASL, as always, for making our events accessible. Thank you all as well to the audience members who joined us online this Tuesday evening. We're so grateful that you shared this Zoom space with us. We're going to keep the Zoom open for a few minutes. We'll play a little bit more music so you can connect in the chat, thank our authors, say hi to everyone, and we hope to see you in person at the Asian American Writers Workshop in the new year. And hopefully we'll run into you sooner on the streets of New York City. But thank you so much, Eugene. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Amelia and Hidra.
Thank you, Lily.
Asian American Writers Workshop. I love the Writers Workshop.
I agree. Thank you. And thank you, Gina.
Thank you so much. We love you. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.